To millions of wrestling fans in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Ultimate Warrior looked unstoppable. He ran to the ring like a madman, shook the ropes with pure energy, and became one of the biggest stars in wrestling after beating Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania VI. But behind the face paint and loud promos was a very different reality. Many wrestlers saw Warrior as reckless, difficult to work with, and completely consumed by his own ego. One of the first people to recognize those problems was Rick Rude, who warned others about Warrior long before his career started falling apart. At the time, almost nobody listened, but years later, nearly everything Rude said about the Ultimate Warrior ended up coming true. Richard Irwin Rude was born on December 7, 1958, in St. Peter, Minnesota. He grew up in Robbinsdale, a suburb of Minneapolis, and attended Robbinsdale High School. Now, Robbinsdale High School might sound unremarkable, but it produced an absolutely absurd number of professional wrestlers. Curt Hennig went there, Tom Zenk went there, Brady Boone, Nikita Koloff, John Nord, Barry Darsow. All of them walked the same hallways as Rick Rude. Something in the water in Robbinsdale, Minnesota, apparently turned teenagers into professional wrestlers. Rude was especially close with Curt Hennig. The two of them grew up together, trained together, and maintained a friendship that lasted until the very end. That bond would prove to be one of the defining relationships of both their lives. But it also tells you something important about Rick Rude as a person. He valued loyalty, he valued friendship, he valued the code that the wrestling business operated on. You look out for the people who look out for you. You respect the guys who put their bodies on the line with you every night. You handle your business face to face, like a man. After graduating from Anoka Ramsey Community College with a degree in physical education, Rude worked as a bouncer for a while before getting into professional wrestling. He trained under Eddie Sharkey, the same legendary trainer who produced Bob Backlund, the Road Warriors, Sean Waltman, and a dozen other stars. And from the very beginning, Rude showed an aptitude for the craft that set him apart from his peers. He bounced around the territories for a few years. Memphis, World Class, Jim Crockett Promotions, Championship Wrestling from Florida. He won titles wherever he went and earned a reputation as a guy who could work. Not just a body, not just a look, a worker. A guy who understood ring psychology, who could tell a story between the ropes, who could make his opponent look like $1,000,000 while simultaneously getting himself over as one of the most despicable heels in the business. By the time Rick Rude arrived in the World Wrestling Federation in 1987, he was a polished, seasoned professional. His gimmick was perfect, the ravishing one. The arrogant pretty boy who would gyrate his hips and insult every man in the audience while seducing their wives and girlfriends. He had the body, the charisma, the in-ring ability, and the promos to back it all up. Managed by Bobby the Brain Heenan, Rude became one of the most complete heel packages the WWE had ever seen. Now let us talk about the man he was about to collide with. Jim Hellwig was born on June 16, 1959 in Crawfordsville, Indiana. He got into bodybuilding in his early 20s and eventually transitioned into professional wrestling, debuting in 1985. He teamed with a young Steve Borden, who would later become Sting, in various tag teams including the Freedom Fighters and the Blade Runners. Eventually, Hellwig went solo, working in world-class championship wrestling as the Dingo Warrior before signing with the WWE in 1987 and becoming the Ultimate Warrior. And here is where things get interesting, because Rude and Warrior actually crossed paths before either of them made it to the WWE. They worked together in World Class, where Warrior competed as a heel, managed by Gary Hart. The two had a falling out as a tag team, and Warrior was eventually cheered as a babyface in a feud against Rick Rude, who was the World Class World Heavyweight Champion at the time. So Rude had the measure of this man, before the bright lights of the WWE ever hit either of them. He knew what Warrior was. He knew what Warrior was not. And that knowledge would prove critical in the years to come. When the Ultimate Warrior debuted in the WWE, he was an absolute sensation. There is no denying that. The energy was real. The crowd reaction was real. Kids genuinely lost their minds when that music hit, and this lunatic came sprinting down the aisle like he was being chased by something only he could see. He squashed the Honky Tonk Man in 27 seconds at SummerSlam 1988 to win the Intercontinental Championship, and just like that, the Warrior was positioned as the next big thing, the next Hogan. But there was a problem, a big one. The Ultimate Warrior could not wrestle. Now, before the Warrior defenders come charging in, let me be clear about what that means. It does not mean he had zero ability. It does not mean he was completely useless. It means that compared to the level he was being pushed at, compared to the main event spot he was being groomed for, his in-ring skills were severely deficient. His matches were short for a reason. His moveset consisted almost entirely of punches, clotheslines, and a gorilla press slam into a running splash. There was no psychology. There was no selling. There was no storytelling. It was just a guy running around at full speed, gassing himself out in 5 minutes, and then pinning somebody. And it was not just that he was limited. It was that he was dangerous. Warrior worked stiff, extremely stiff. His punches landed hard. And when people tried to talk to him about it, to say, hey man, lighten up a little, you are going to hurt somebody, Warrior did not want to hear it. He was the chosen one. He was the next Hogan. And in his mind, that meant he could do whatever he wanted, however he wanted to do it. This is where Rick Rude enters the picture in the most significant way. In late 1988 and into 1989, the WWE began building toward what would become one of the defining rivalries of the era. Rick Rude versus the Ultimate Warrior for the Intercontinental Championship. The feud kicked off at the 1989 Royal Rumble with a superpose down that ended with Rude attacking Warrior. It was a brilliant piece of booking because it played perfectly into both characters. The vain, pretty boy versus the raw, animalistic force. But here is what was really happening. Vince McMahon needed Warrior to have longer matches. He needed Warrior to prove he could go more than 5 minutes if he was going to be the guy who eventually beat Hulk Hogan. And for that to happen, Warrior needed a dance partner who could carry him. Somebody who could structure a match, call spots on the fly, cover for mistakes, and make the Warrior look like something he absolutely was not. A complete professional wrestler. Rick Rude was that man. And he was possibly the only man on the roster who could have done it. At WrestleMania V, Rude defeated the Ultimate Warrior to win the Intercontinental Championship, thanks to interference from Bobby Heenan. The match went about 10 minutes. By Warrior standards, that was a marathon. And virtually every person who has ever watched that match with a critical eye has come to the same conclusion. Rude carried it. Rude structured it. Rude sold like his life depended on it to make Warrior look like an unstoppable monster. And Rude guided Warrior through every single moment of that contest. The rematch at SummerSlam 1989 was even better. Over 16 minutes this time. An absolute clinic in how to work with a limited opponent. Rude sold, Rude bumped. Rude made Warrior look like $1 million while simultaneously telling a compelling story. Warrior won back the Intercontinental Championship, and fans went home happy. It remains one of the best matches of Warrior's entire career. And there is a reason for that. Rick Rude made it happen. Without Rude, that match would have been a disaster. But here is the thing that nobody talks about enough. While Rick Rude was out there working his tail off to make the Ultimate Warrior look like a legitimate main event star, Warrior was showing him absolutely no respect in return. According to Ric Flair, speaking on his Woo Nation podcast, Warrior felt that Rude was not a big enough draw to be the Intercontinental Champion. He openly stated that Rude had no business being in the title picture. Think about the audacity of that statement for a moment. This was a man who could barely work a 10-minute match without someone holding his hand through it, and he was looking down on the guy who was literally making his career possible, the guy who was carrying him to the best matches he would ever have. The guy who was putting his own body on the line every single night to make the Warrior look credible. And it was not just the disrespect toward Rude personally. It was the stiff work. It was the recklessness. It was the punches that landed too hard and the clotheslines that connected with too much force. Every night, Rude would go out there, put his body in the hands of a man who did not know how to protect his opponents, and hope that he would survive the encounter without a serious injury. And every night, Warrior would throw those potato shots like he was actually trying to hurt people. Rick Rude put up with it for a long time. Longer than most people would have. Because Rude was a professional, because he understood that the business came first. because he knew that this feud was making both of them money and advancing both of their careers. But every man has a breaking point. And in 1990, Rick Rude reached his. The exact details vary depending on who you ask, but the core of the story remains consistent across multiple accounts. After a match, Rude had finally had enough of the stiff work. He confronted Warrior backstage and told him directly to stop being so reckless, to start protecting his opponents the way a professional is supposed to recognize that just because he was the champion did not mean he had the right to hurt people. According to witnesses, Warrior's response was something to the effect of, "I do not have to listen to you. I am the champion. I can work however I want." That was the wrong thing to say to Rick Rude. That was the absolute worst thing you could possibly say to a man who valued professionalism, who respected the craft, who had trained under Eddie Sharkey and honed his skills in the territories for years before getting to the big time. A man who also happened to be a trained amateur boxer with a well-documented history of not tolerating disrespect. Rude hit him, one punch, and the WWE champion went down. Demolition Smash, who was in the locker room at the time, has corroborated this version of events. He remembered the beating stemming specifically from Warrior working too stiff, and Rude ending the confrontation quickly and decisively. Ric Flair told a different version on his podcast, claiming that Rude administered a longer beating after hearing Warrior trash-talk him from across the locker room. Flair was not in the WWE at the time, so he likely heard this secondhand, but the core elements line up. Kevin Nash later shared Rude's own account of the incident on his Click This podcast. According to Nash, who became close with Rude when both were in WCW, the physical confrontation stemmed from Warrior's refusal to lose to Rude. Warrior told Rude that he was not worthy of being put over, and Rude took matters into his own hands. Whatever the exact catalyst was, whether it was the stiff work, the disrespect, the refusal to do business, or some combination of all three, the result was the same. Rick Rude punched the WWE champion in the face and put him on the ground. And in that moment, Rude was saying something that went beyond the personal animosity between two wrestlers. He was saying that this man is a problem. This man is dangerous. This man does not respect the business, does not respect his colleagues, and does not deserve the position he has been given. Nobody listened. The WWE sided with Warrior. Of course they did. Warrior was the champion. Warrior was the draw. Warrior was the guy that Vince McMahon had invested everything in. You do not punish the goose that lays the golden eggs, even if the goose is reckless, unprofessional, and actively hurting the people around it. So Rude was left to stew. And Warrior kept on doing exactly what he had been doing. Their final match took place at SummerSlam 1990, a steel cage bout for the WWE Championship. It went about 10 minutes, and Rude once again carried Warrior to an entertaining contest. But the magic was gone. The relationship was poisoned beyond repair. And shortly after that, Rude left the WWE entirely. Now, there is a layer to Rude's departure that adds salt to the wound. After busting his body for years, after carrying the company's top babyface through the biggest matches of his career, after literally making the Ultimate Warrior into a credible main eventer, Rick Rude looked at his pay and realized he was being massively undervalued. He had main evented SummerSlam. He had been the heel in the biggest program in the company, and his payoff did not reflect any of that. The top guy got the top money, and Rude got whatever was left over. Furious over the perceived lack of respect, both financial and professional, Rude left the WWE and went to WCW, where he became the centerpiece of the Dangerous Alliance alongside Paul E. Dangerously, Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Larry Zbyszko, and Steve Austin. It was arguably the greatest heel faction of its era, and Rude was at the center of it. He thrived in WCW because he was finally being treated like what he was, a top-tier talent who deserved top-tier recognition. There is another story that perfectly illustrates the dynamic between Rude and Warrior, and it adds a layer of pettiness to the whole situation that is almost unbearable. Bruce Pritchard told it on his Something to Wrestle With podcast. According to Pritchard, Warrior used to bring Andre the Giant wine in the locker room. just showing up with bottles of wine for Andre, trying to ingratiate himself with the biggest legend in the business. On the surface, you might think that is a nice gesture. But Rude saw it for what it was. Warrior was kissing up to the one man in the locker room who could not be ignored, while simultaneously disrespecting every other worker who was out there, putting him over night after night. Rude was reportedly furious about it. He felt that Warrior showed no appreciation whatsoever for what Rude had done for him. Here was a guy who had structured Warrior's best matches, who had sold for him like a champion, who had literally made him look like a main event talent through sheer force of ring generalship. And instead of showing Rude any gratitude, Warrior was sucking up to Andre while telling people that Rude was not worthy of being in the title picture. The hypocrisy was staggering. And there is something else worth mentioning about the contrast between these two men and the careers they built after their feud ended. Rick Rude went on to have excellent matches with other top-tier opponents. His work in WCW with the Dangerous Alliance was outstanding. His matches with Ricky Steamboat, Sting, and Dustin Rhodes demonstrated that he was not just a good worker but a great one. He could go with anyone, at any length, and produce quality. He was the real deal. A consummate professional who elevated everyone he worked with. Warrior, on the other hand, never had another feud that reached the level of what he had with Rude. Not even close. His matches got shorter. His opponents had to work harder and harder to get anything watchable out of him. The WrestleMania VII match against Randy Savage is often cited as Warrior's other great match, and while it was excellent, the vast majority of the credit goes to Savage, who was one of the most meticulous and brilliant in-ring performers in the history of the business. Left to his own devices, without a Rude or a Savage to guide him, Warrior was exposed time and time again as a performer who simply could not carry his end of the deal. This is the part that should have been obvious to everyone from the start. Rick Rude was not just complaining because he had personal beef with Warrior. He was making a professional assessment. He was saying that this man is not good enough, not professional enough, and not trustworthy enough to be in the position he has been given. And everything that happened over the next decade proved him right beyond any reasonable doubt. There is also the matter of how Rude conducted himself when he finally had enough of the WWE. When Rude left for WCW, he did not just sulk in the corner and collect a paycheck. He went to work. He threw himself into the Dangerous Alliance and helped create one of the most compelling faction storylines in wrestling history. He proved that his talent was not dependent on one company or one opponent. He was a star wherever he went because he had substance behind the style. He had real ability, real charisma, and real respect for the craft. Compare that to Warrior's post-WWE trajectory. Every new opportunity was squandered. Every second chance was wasted. Every company that took a gamble on him lived to regret it. Because the fundamental problems that Rick Rude had identified were never addressed. They were never corrected. They were never even acknowledged until it was far too late to do anything about them. But what about the man he left behind? What happened to the Ultimate Warrior after Rick Rude was no longer there to carry him, to structure his matches, to make him look like something he was not? Everything fell apart, and it happened almost exactly the way Rude would have predicted. The first major crack appeared just 1 year after Rude left. Going into SummerSlam 1991, the Ultimate Warrior was scheduled to team with Hulk Hogan against Sergeant Slaughter, Colonel Mustafa, and General Adnan. It should have been a massive event. Instead, it nearly became a catastrophe. Before the show, Warrior sent Vince McMahon a letter containing a list of demands. He wanted an additional $500,000. He wanted a set schedule. He wanted a higher percentage of merchandise sales. His reasoning was simple. He believed he was just as important to the WWE as Hulk Hogan, if not more so, and he threatened to no-show the main event of SummerSlam if his demands were not met. Vince McMahon, not wanting to blow up his pay-per-view main event, reluctantly agreed to the demands. He wrote the check. He gave Warrior what he wanted. And then, the moment the match was over, McMahon fired him. This was exactly the kind of behavior Rick Rude had been warning about. The entitlement, the ego, the belief that being pushed to the top meant you could hold the entire company hostage. Rude had seen it building for years. He had watched Warrior's head swell to grotesque proportions while his respect for the business shrank to nothing. And when Rude tried to confront it, tried to put a check on it, He was the one who was pushed aside while Warrior was allowed to continue unchecked. But the SummerSlam 1991 debacle was only the beginning. A few months after being fired, Warrior was brought back. And then he was fired again. This time after failing a drug test during the WWE's steroid scandal. The same physique that had made him a superstar was built on a foundation that the company could no longer publicly endorse. Warrior was cut loose in 1992, and the era of the Ultimate Warrior was effectively over. Except it was not over. Because Warrior kept coming back. And every time he came back, the same problems resurfaced. In 1996, the WWE was in desperate need of star power. WCW was eating their lunch. Guys like Kevin Nash and Scott Hall had jumped ship. The company needed recognizable names, and the Ultimate Warrior was still one of the most recognizable names in wrestling. So they brought him back. It lasted 4 months. 4 disastrous months. From the beginning, the old problems were right there on the surface. He squashed Triple H at WrestleMania 12 in a match that accomplished nothing except burying a young talent who desperately needed credibility. His matches were terrible. His promos were incomprehensible. And worst of all, the behavioral issues that had gotten him fired the first 2 times came roaring back immediately. He started no-showing live events. He stopped answering phone calls from the office. When the company finally got hold of him, he blamed his absences on the death of his father, a man he reportedly had not seen in at least a decade. He demanded that the WWE purchase enormous quantities of his self-published comic book, and when they refused to meet his demands, it caused even more tension. Bruce Pritchard, who was Vince McMahon's right-hand man at the time, later addressed this period on his Something to Wrestle podcast. His assessment was devastating in its simplicity. You could deal with difficult people if the results justified it. But the results were not there. Warrior was not drawing. His matches were bad. His reliability was non-existent. And he was still just as difficult to deal with as he had ever been. There was no upside left to balance against the constant headaches. The WWE fired him again. His 3rd exit from the company in less than a decade. Each one uglier than the last. And then came WCW, because of course it did. In 1998, WCW had more money than sense and decided that what their red-hot product really needed was the Ultimate Warrior feuding with Hollywood Hulk Hogan. On paper, it was a dream scenario. The rematch of WrestleMania VI 8 years later, with the entire NWO storyline as the backdrop. In practice, it was one of the most embarrassing chapters in WCW history. Warrior had magical powers for some reason. He appeared in mirrors. He teleported. There were smoke bombs. The match at Halloween Havoc 1998 was one of the worst pay-per-view main events ever broadcast. Warrior was done in WCW almost as quickly as he had arrived, and this time, there were no more second chances waiting for him. The wrestling business had finally, completely and irrevocably caught up to what Rick Rude had been saying for nearly a decade. Let us take a step back and really absorb that timeline. Because when you lay it all out end to end, the pattern is undeniable. In 1989 and 1990, Rick Rude identified the Warrior as a reckless, unprofessional, entitled performer who did not respect the business or the people in it. He tried to hold Warrior accountable. He confronted him directly. He told him the truth. And for that, Rude was dismissed, marginalized, and eventually pushed out of the company. In 1991, Warrior held the company hostage for money before SummerSlam and was fired. In 1992, he was fired again after failing a drug test. In 1996, he came back, no-showed events, made impossible demands, and was fired a 3rd time. In 1998, he went to WCW and embarrassed himself in one of the worst feuds of the Monday Night Wars era. At every single step along the way, the problems were the same ones Rude had identified years earlier. The ego, the recklessness, the refusal to listen, the belief that the rules did not apply to him, the contempt for his fellow performers, the inability to work safely and professionally in the ring. And it was not just Rick Rude who suffered because of these traits. The list of people who had legitimate problems with the Ultimate Warrior reads like a who's who of professional wrestling. Bret Hart wrote about losing all respect for Warrior after witnessing how he treated a child from the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Imagine that. A dying child wants to meet their hero, and the hero cannot be bothered to treat the experience with basic human decency. That is who the Ultimate Warrior was behind the face paint. Jake Roberts had issues with Warrior that nearly turned physical at the 2014 Hall of Fame ceremony. The two were in the middle of a brilliant storyline in 1991 when Warrior was fired, leaving the entire angle dangling with no resolution. Roberts was one of many performers whose work was directly damaged by Warrior's inability to keep his ego in check. Jerry Lawler told a story about working with Warrior during his 1996 return. They had rehearsed a spot involving a picture frame multiple times. Both men knew exactly how it was supposed to work. And then Warrior came to the ring wearing a baseball cap, something he had never done before and would never do again, effectively sabotaging the spot they had carefully planned. Even Andre the Giant had problems with Warrior. Andre warned Warrior about working too stiff. Warrior shrugged it off and kept throwing his reckless punches. So Andre knocked him senseless with one shot. After that, Warrior was reportedly more careful around Andre. But that correction only applied to a man who weighed 500 pounds and whom everyone on the planet was afraid of. With everyone else, Warrior went right back to his usual dangerous style. And there is a cruel irony embedded in all of this. Because Rick Rude, the man who tried to correct these problems early, the man who stood up when nobody else would, ended up paying a price for his integrity. He left the WWE in frustration and anger. He left behind a main event position and a reliable paycheck because he could not stomach the way Warrior conducted himself and the way the company enabled it. Meanwhile, Warrior was given chance after chance after chance. 3 separate WWE runs, a WCW contract, multiple world title shots, millions of dollars in merchandise revenue. All of it handed to a man who had done virtually nothing to earn the trust of his colleagues and had done everything possible to betray it. In 2005, WWE released a documentary called The Self-Destruction of the Ultimate Warrior. It was essentially 2 hours of current and former wrestlers lining up to say everything Rick Rude had been saying for 15 years. That Warrior was difficult to work with, that he was dangerous in the ring, that his ego was out of control, that he treated people poorly, that his success was largely the product of other people's hard work, specifically the people who carried him to his best matches and structured his career path. The documentary would in 2014, after Warrior and the company had mended fences, WWE effectively buried it. But the criticism of the same stories Rick Rude had been telling since the late 1980s. The saddest part of this entire saga is that Rick Rude never got to see Vindication. He never got to see the wrestling world acknowledge that he had been right all along. Rude passed away on April 20th, 1999, from heart failure caused by an accidental overdose of mixed medications. He was only 40 years old. A career-ending injury sustained in a match against Sting in Japan in 1994 had forced him out of active competition, and the pain management issues that followed contributed to his untimely death. But even in his final years, Rude continued to demonstrate the same principled nature that had put him at odds with the Ultimate Warrior. In 1997, he was part of D-Generation X in the WWE, serving as an insurance policy and enforcer for Shawn Michaels. When the Montreal Screwjob happened at Survivor Series, when Vince McMahon and Shawn Michaels conspired to screw Bret Hart out of the WWE Championship, in his final match with the company, Rude was disgusted. He quit the WWE immediately and showed up on WCW Nitro the very next night. His first words on WCW television were a direct shot at Michaels, calling out the injustice of what had happened and making it clear that he wanted no part of a company that would treat one of its champions that way. That is who Rick Rude was. A man who valued honor. A man who stood up for what was right even when it cost him personally. A man who walked away from money and opportunity because his principles would not allow him to stay silent in the face of something he believed was wrong. He did it when Warrior was working stiff and disrespecting his colleagues. He did it when his payoff at SummerSlam did not reflect his contribution. And he did it again when Bret Hart was betrayed in Montreal. Every single time Rick Rude was faced with a choice between doing what was easy and doing what was right, he chose right. and every single time the wrestling business punished him for it. In 2017, Rick Rude was posthumously inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. Ricky Steamboat, one of the greatest workers in wrestling history, did the honors. Rude's family accepted on his behalf. And while the ceremony was a fitting tribute to a man who had given everything to the business, it also served as a quiet reminder of what might have been. Because if the WWE had listened to Rick Rude in 1989 and 1990, if they had taken his concerns about the Ultimate Warrior seriously instead of dismissing them, things might have turned out very differently. Maybe Warrior would have been forced to improve his ring work. Maybe he would have learned to respect his opponents. Maybe the ego would have been checked before it metastasized into something uncontrollable. Maybe Rude would have stayed in the WWE, continued to main event, and been recognized as the elite talent he so obviously was. But that is not what happened. What happened is what always happens when institutions choose to protect their investments over listening to the people who are telling them the truth. The problems get bigger. The damage gets worse. And by the time the institution finally acknowledges what went wrong, the person who tried to warn them is long gone. There is a broader lesson here that extends beyond professional wrestling. Rick Rude was the canary in the coal mine. He was the guy who identified a systemic problem and tried to address it through the proper channels and, when those channels failed, through direct confrontation. And the system punished him for it. Not because he was wrong, everyone knew he was right, but because acknowledging that he was right would have meant acknowledging that the system itself had made a catastrophic error in judgment. It is easier to push out the dissenter than to fix the problem. It is easier to silence the person raising the alarm than to address the fire they are pointing at. And it is especially easy when the problem you are ignoring is generating revenue. Because in the moment, it always seems like the money justifies the madness, until it does not. The Ultimate Warrior generated enormous revenue during his peak years. Nobody disputes that. But the wreckage he left behind, the career he sabotaged, the trust he betrayed, the goodwill he squandered, all of that had a cost too. A cost that the WWE paid again and again and again, every time they brought him back and watched the same problems explode in their faces. Rick Rude saw all of that coming. He tried to stop it. He was ignored. And then he was gone. In the end, Warrior did eventually try to make amends. In the final days of his life, during the 2014 Hall of Fame weekend, he apologized to Jake Roberts. He made himself available to Roberts' children and grandchildren. He seemed genuinely humbled by the experience. And then, just days after being inducted into the Hall of Fame and cutting a hauntingly prophetic promo on Monday Night Raw about every man's heart beating its final beat, the Ultimate Warrior collapsed outside a hotel and died from a heart attack at the age of 54. It was a shocking and deeply sad ending. And it is possible to hold two truths simultaneously: that the Ultimate Warrior was a flawed, difficult, often destructive human being who caused real harm to the people around him, and also that his death was a tragedy, that his final days showed genuine growth, and that the character he created brought real joy to millions of fans. But the fact that Warrior found some measure of redemption at the end does not erase the fact that Rick Rude was right about him from the beginning. It does not erase the years of reckless behavior, the stiff punches that injured colleagues, the ego that held companies hostage, the contempt for the people who made his career possible. And it does not erase the fact that the one man who tried to do something about it was pushed aside, undervalued, and ultimately forgotten until it was far too late. Rick Rude deserved better. He deserved better from the Ultimate Warrior, who owed him his best matches and a significant portion of his main event credibility. He deserved better from the WWE, which used his brilliance to build their next megastar and then let him walk when he had the audacity to demand fair treatment. And he deserved better from history, which for too long remembered him as just another heel in a long line of heels, rather than recognizing him for what he truly was. One of the most talented, most professional, and most principled performers the wrestling business has ever produced. Ravishing Rick Rude he was right about the entitlement. He was right about the danger. He was right about everything. And nobody listened until it was far, far too late. That is the real tragedy of this story. Not that the Ultimate Warrior self-destructed. Everyone could see that coming eventually. The tragedy is that one man tried to prevent it, tried to sound the alarm, tried to force accountability on a system that did not want to be held accountable. And the system chewed him up and spit him out. The wrestling business has always been cruel to the people who tell the truth. It rewards the people who play the game, who keep their mouths shut, who go along to get along. The troublemakers, the boat rockers, the guys who stand up and say this is wrong, they are the ones who get punished. Not because they are wrong. Almost always they are right. But because being right is not enough. Not in wrestling. Not in business. Not in life. Rick Rude was right, and nobody listened. And by the time they did, the only thing left to do was induct him into a Hall of Fame he was not alive to enjoy and tell stories about the time he punched the champion in the face for being a reckless, disrespectful, ungrateful liability to everyone around him. If there is any justice in the wrestling afterlife, Rick Rude is somewhere right now, flexing those legendary abs, doing his hip swivel, and saying, "I told you so." Because he did tell them so. He told every single one of them. And not a single soul had the courage to listen. The next time you watch those old WrestleMania V and SummerSlam 1989 matches, pay attention to Rick Rude. Watch how he sells. Watch how he structures the action. Watch how he calls the match, covers for mistakes, and makes everything look smooth and professional. And then remember that the man doing all of that incredible work was being disrespected, underpaid, and dismissed by the man he was carrying on his back. Remember that Rick Rude tried to fix the problem. And remember that nobody listened until the problem had destroyed everything it touched. Like and subscribe for more hard-hitting wrestling documentaries. Until next time.